I'm Nadia Swat for BizNews.com, and joining me today is Dane Wigington. He's the lead researcher at geoengineeringwatch.org and the executive producer of a documentary called The Dimming, which exposes the climate engineering cover-up. Dane, it's a pleasure to finally get the chance to speak to you.
You too, Nadia. Thank you very much for your willingness to address the climate engineering issue that too few are aware of at this point.
So I want to get straight into it, but just for context, Geoengineering Watch indicates that there are two primary ideologies driving climate modification, and this is solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. Just for context, can you briefly walk me through these concepts?
Well, again, with CDR, that's another subject completely that we do not deal with, and we see no technology that has any viability whatsoever in that arena. But our primary objective at geoengineeringwatch.org is to expose to the public programs that have been fully deployed for decades with no public disclosure, no environmental impact reports whatsoever. And that's with solar radiation management, cloud albedo enhancement, stratospheric aerosol injection. Those are all the science names that are applicable to what's going on in our skies that the entire so-called climate science community continues to pretend are just proposals. And when we have film footage of these operations occurring up close, taken at altitude, nozzles visible, turning on and off, we have lab tests from all over the world that show the exact same elements named in climate engineering patents showing up in our precipitation. And geoengineeringwatch.org, Nadia, actually at tremendous expense and difficulty, acquired a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration flying lab, put top scientists in it, went to altitude, sampled what heavy aircraft were emitting in our skies, processed those samples at one of the world's most renowned labs, Rensselaer Polytechnic University, found exactly what we knew we'd find, climate engineering elements. So there's no speculation. These operations are absolutely going on. And back to your question, primary objectives, weather is being used as a weapon at this point. It's a very valued weapon by those in control because they can blame it on nature. And also the psychological aspect of this, when they can engineer cool down events, as they're doing in the US right now on an extraordinary scale with chemical ice nucleation for weather modification, seeding clouds with chemical ice nucleating elements that create an endothermic reaction, which creates a cold dense layer of air that descends to the surface and lowers temperatures dramatically, even turning what should have been liquid precipitation into frozen. They're literally engineering winter. And in doing so, they can affect psychologically people's perspective on the state of the climate and state of the environment, in addition to using weather as a weapon.
Your story, how you came to investigate climate and the irregularities that became apparent. I only know a few details, but it's almost quite serendipitous. Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, certainly. I never ever intended to spend the last 20 years of my life in such a battle. I'm not politically oriented and have never been an activist of any type. I wanted to get into a region of clean air, having grown up in Southern California and the smog there. And when I finally got to Northern California, off grid wilderness location, off grid home with solar, wind, and hydropower, expecting to find clean air here, but I began to lose massive amounts of my solar uptake from whatever these aircraft were emitting. I mean, extraordinary amounts, 60, 70, 80% on some days when these aircraft emissions could cover the entire sky. I knew that could not be condensation blocking 60, 70, 80% of my solar power production. I began to test my precipitation, hoped I would not find climate engineering elements in it, starting with aluminum, but I did. I continued to test. The amounts of aluminum in my precipitation continued to escalate radically in lockstep with what these aircraft were emitting. And I was simply forced, after I began to do extensive research and finding extraordinary amounts of material that no one had covered from a media standpoint, government documents, Senate documents on this subject, I was forced to face the fact that climate engineering operations were indeed going on and not being disclosed. There's an illegal federal gag order at this point on all National Weather Service and NOAA employees. Why would you gag the weathermen if you weren't hiding something massive? So, knowing this was going on, Nadia, I just had no choice from a standpoint of my conscience but to address this issue and try to gain public disclosure.
On that point, the test that you conducted, you knew what elements had been named in climate engineering patterns, and that's what you were looking for. So, other than aluminum, what did you find? And how did you know that it was there as a result of climate engineering operations?
Well, when we have an aircraft sampling what another heavy aircraft is emitting in the skies, that could only be from one source. So there's no speculation at that point. There's no hypothesis or theory.
Mm.
And on the aluminum itself, again, primary element named in climate engineering patents, stratospheric aerosol seeding for reduction of global warming. That's the name of one of the patents. I attended an international climate engineering conference with the world's most recognized geoengineer, Dr. David Keith, there. It's on film on the record and in the film The Dimming, which you mentioned earlier, available for free on
Yeah.
the homepage of Geoengineering Watch. And at that symposium,
Mm.
the world's most recognized geoengineer, Dr. David Keith, stating their intent to dump tens of millions of tons of aluminum into the atmosphere. Why aluminum? Because aluminum is reflective. That's the stated goal of solar radiation management, to deflect some of the sun's incoming thermal energy to slow down global warming. And at the end of this presentation by Dr. Keith, again on film on the record, they only allowed, I believe, two questions. I was one. I asked him, had any environmental impact studies been done about human toxicity, toxicology studies, environmental or human? And his answer was no. And his final statement was, could terrible things happen tomorrow? We don't know. What kind of a statement is that from the world's most recognized climate engineer and their proposal to dump tens of millions of tons of aluminum in the atmosphere? And in fact, so much aluminum has come down in our precipitation here in Northern California that it's changed soil pH values extraordinarily. We have the original government baselines from well over a half century ago. So we're not guessing. It's killing everything here. Our forests are dying, insects are dying. And we know that this aluminum is in the precipitation because we continue to test not just aluminum, barium, strontium, graphene, polymer fibers. The list is long, all of it toxic.
Mm. I think I recall, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost as if you spoke in jest about the fact that, we don't know how many lives will be lost as a result of these, elements being injected or into the environment, but it might be very small compared to the effects of climate change. It was a very, almost, for lack of a better word, irresponsible thing to be said by someone that people look to as world experts on things.
I completely agree. Completely agree with you. The cavalier manner in which they discuss dumping
Mm.
this toxic material into our atmospheres and then grossly underestimate the mortality rate is inexcusable. Who gave them the right to do
Mm.
this? Who gave anyone the
Mm.
right to interfere with the Earth's weather systems and claim that they know best
Yeah.
what's best for us, what's best for the planet, which couldn't be further from the truth. And if we look at the very premise, Nadia, of solar radiation management to put these light scattering particles in the sky, we now have recent peer-reviewed study to prove that this can only create temporary toxic cooling at the cost of an even worse overall warming, destruction of the ozone layer, total disruption of the hydrological cycle, and complete contamination of virtually everything on the surface. So when we have this much metal coming down on us, again, based on their estimates and based on our extrapolations from rain samples and the amount of aluminum in those samples, we're talking about tens of millions of tons in the case of aluminum annually sprayed into our skies. Is it any wonder that Alzheimer's, dementia, ALS, and countless other forms of neurological degenerative diseases are going off the charts? We're inhaling this material with every breath we take, and no one in the climate science community, so I don't even want to call them scientists, because this omission of blatant, glaring, verifiable truth is absolutely criminal. They don't deserve to be called scientists, Nadia. And this destruction of the planet's natural life support systems is absolutely criminal.
Let's look at the timeline of weather modification, because anyone that does any research about it is going to find such contradictory results. I mean, it started after World War II. It's been proposed as a potential future exercise to mitigate climate change between governments, and then there's also, that it dates back to more than 100 years ago. According to your research, how far back does weather modification go?
It appears that global geoengineering operations were first deployed immediately after World War II. So, to put this into context, many people refer to the B-17 bombers, for example, that we've all seen pictures of leaving these massive trails in the sky, as proof that this is just condensation. That couldn't be further from the truth either. We found on military archival footage film captures taken from one B-17 bomber of another. They all of them flying in formation, leaving a massive dispersion behind that B-17 that was shut off instantly in air as if it was cut with a knife. That means that that was not condensation to begin with. They were beta testing during World War II to deploy immediately after World War II, which we believe they did over the poles first. And aluminum began showing up there over the poles, called an Arctic haze that had aluminum in it. And this was noted by a Stanford science study. They didn't know where it was coming from. And so again, the history is very extensive, and we have other forms of weather manipulation. Again, I would call it weather warfare ultimately, but Project Cirrus, started by the US military, their first hurricane modification operation started in 1947, and there's a long history since. Some of these instances more well known. For example, Project Popeye in Vietnam, very well known, weather modification over Vietnam that was so successful that in the 70s, a moratorium was passed for using weather warfare. And this is, again, an international law that no one pays any attention to. But the denial of these operations is beyond belief at this point, that the public can still accept this when we can look into our skies here, one day a grid pattern, the next day nothing, with similar atmospheric conditions. We have, again, up close film footage of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible, turning on and off, military tankers, C-17s, KC-10s, KC-135s. The denial of this issue is absolutely ludicrous at this point. Through that light, any form of weather modification is weather warfare. Even the simple premise of, in theory, seeding clouds in one place to make them precipitate, that means that rain didn't get where it was going. Now let's push this a little further into the weather warfare arena. When we have countries, for example, like the Middle Eastern countries, immediately after 9/11, Nadia, we had a list of Middle Eastern countries that were the target countries, a list that clearly existed before 9/11 even occurred. This list was presented to former NATO Supreme Commander General Wesley Clark. Every single one of those countries subsequently endured a once in 1,000 year drought. Their precipitation was literally cut off. We have leaders of those countries, in the case of Iran, on the floor of the UN stating emphatically that NATO was cutting off their precipitation, and they know what's going on in their skies. They have sophisticated monitoring equipment, radar, satellite images. So again, we have a very, very glaring instances of weather being used as a weapon, cutting off precipitation, destabilizing food production, thus destabilizing populations. And we see exactly the same happening right now off the coast of Portugal, Spain, the US West Coast, rendering California's agricultural production uh, devastating it, in fact. And we're not guessing. We can see these operations on satellite imagery. We can speculate on the agendas and the objectives, but the fact that climate intervention operations are being used as a weapon of war is absolutely inarguable.
The climate change narrative, I mean, it went from global warming to climate change to a climate emergency and a climate crisis. Would you say that it's plausible that that has all been very well predetermined strategy to normalize climate engineering so that people get very, very afraid? They're told the world is going to end. They're looking at the climate around them. They're following a certain thing, and fear is a very, very big motivator, and also it completely incapacitates logic and reason for them to then, if they do discover that it is in fact bio warfare, or no, sorry, not bio warfare, but weather warfare, that it'll almost be sort of diluted in the impact that it has on humans when they find that out, because they realize, and they were introduced to the idea thereof as something that was virtuous and necessary.
When those in power sell us something as being virtuous and necessary, you know there's a problem. And you mentioned the term biowarfare. In fact, this absolutely is also a form of biowarfare. We know these elements are highly toxic in and of themselves. Again, aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers, graphene, surfactants we have now in this frozen material that's coming down. This is a very, very lethal mix. But in the case of two of those elements, polymer fibers and graphene, we know that those elements are used for biological carrier platforms. What's that mean? It means that they can be used as a platform to carry biologicals from the clouds to the ground. If I could, and I'll back up on more of your question in a moment, but I want to finish this line of thought. When we have this world's second most recognized climate engineer, Dr. Ken Caldera, former U.S. Department of Defense climate scientist, we have him on audio, on the record, stating, quote, one of his tasks for the U.S. Department of Defense was to design ways of spraying pathogens into clouds to infect the populations below. That's a very, very ominous description of what he did for the U.S. military. And when we have these elements coming down in our precipitation now, how can we not consider that a form of biological warfare as well? In regard to the state of the climate, what our position would be at geoengineeringwatch.org is this: how can we have any legitimate discussion of the climate from any perspective without first and foremost acknowledging the climate intervention insanity, which we know, based on all available data, although it can cause and is causing radical temperature swings, and thus the term climate change was coined in 1998 because they ramped up the programs after that year, and they knew they would be causing radical swings in temperature. So they coined the term climate change, much as you described, instead of just global warming, to make the narrative fit what was going to happen. And in the case of what geoengineering actually does, short-term toxic cool downs at the cost of damaging the planet even further, destroying the ozone layer. We're giving narratives right now, Nadia, that the ozone layer is recovering. Couldn't be further from the truth. We're metering that. Former NASA
Mm.
contract engineer works directly for us. We're getting UVC on the surface. It's killing plankton, killing insects. Again, this road leads back to climate engineering, not hairspray cans, as we're told, that contain CFCs, which are a problem, but it's a very, very small problem compared to climate engineering. When we have military tankers that can dump 100 tons of toxic ozone-destroying material into the atmosphere in a single payload. So again, right now, if we look at this statistically, mathematically, the single greatest threat for the human race, the single greatest and most immediate, short of nuclear cataclysm, is climate engineering.
The stated purpose on almost all what UN documents and global governance documents for climate engineering is to block the sun.
Correct.
So I've had interviews with Dr. John Christie, Dr. Judith Curry. These are very incredibly qualified climate scientists, climatologists. They really do know what they're talking about. So the fact that they want to block the sun almost indicates to me immediately that the climate scientists or climate engineers and the politicians who are acting on their advice are coming from a fundamentally flawed and complete misunderstanding of sound climate science.
From any perspective on the state of the climate, from any side of the fence, if there's a conversation that doesn't first and foremost include and acknowledge the climate intervention factor in the equation, we would argue that discussion is illegitimate. And we have the same omission from all sides of the fence. We have an illegal federal gag order, as I mentioned a moment ago, on all National Weather Service and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration employees. Why would they gag the weathermen if there wasn't something massive to hide? The liability issue here is incalculable. If the population finds out, populations all over the world find out that their governments have actively or passively participated in what amounts to weather warfare, and that no weather cataclysm at this point can be considered, quote, natural, what will that population do? Will they take to the streets with their proverbial pitchforks and torches and look for anyone and everyone involved with these programs? One would think they might. So those in power will do everything they can to hide and deny that these operations are going on. And we see that denial, Nadia, from every side of this discussion.
With regards to climate engineering and the way in which it's affected the Earth's climate thus far. One of the cornerstones of the climate crisis narrative is look around you. The extreme weather events that have occurred recently are unprecedented.
In the case of the state of the biosphere, we absolutely have extraordinarily grave ramifications, much of them attributable to climate engineering. I'm not citing climate engineering as the only source of damage to the planet. I think it's clear if we look at this rationally, the human race has not been very good stewards of the planet. That being said, climate intervention operations have disabled the planet's ability to respond. In the case of CO2, for example, if not for climate engineering, the planet would have responded in a very different way to any increased levels of CO2.
The planet tends to self correct.
It would have done a much, much better job, correct. So why isn't it? Because one, climate engineering, as I mentioned a moment ago, is the single greatest factor destroying the ozone layer. So now we have extremely high UV radiation damaging the foliage of the flora. We have toxic elements, as we already talked about, coming down in our precipitation. We have peer-reviewed study to prove in the case of aluminum, it not only kills soil microbiome, it affects root systems. So the trees can't and won't absorb nutrients. They die a slow, protracted death. Climate engineering elements, depending on the type they're spraying, are desiccant particles, which they alter atmospheric chemistry. They alter the relative humidity. When the humidity is too low, as it now is in, for example, Northern California, where I live, it's often half the historical norm. Not enough humidity means the trees and flora shut their stomata, their respiratory ports, so they don't breathe, they don't absorb CO2, they don't expel oxygen, there's no forest smell whatsoever. They're dying below the surface of the soils because of the toxins I mentioned. From every conceivable direction, climate engineering is decimating the planet's life support systems and its ability to respond to any changes that are occurring. Again, not to mention contaminating every breath we take. I would again clearly state that the decimation that's happening to the biosphere is not an intent, it's a consequence of what they're doing. They're not going to let go of this weapon, no matter what the consequences. Again, a covert, it's the crown jewel weapon of the climate of the controllers. The climate engineering issue is, and again, they can decimate populations, they can bring them to their knees without those populations ever even knowing they're under assault. In regard to the human race and its interaction with nature and the planet, bad record there. We've certainly been horrible stewards of the planet. I don't think there's any arguing that rationally. But for those in power, this weapon to manipulate the climate not only enable them to wage covert warfare against populations without those populations ever even knowing they're under assault, but it can also mask any damage done to the planet by dividing and confusing the population as to the true state of damage done. In the case of, we look at these cool downs that are happening in the US right now, for example, Nadia, we have winter storms week after week in the US that are originating from the record warm Gulf of Mexico. How can that possibly be? Historically, it's unprecedented. We have warm flows of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico that suddenly flash out to snow. We have them using those terms, rain changing over to snow. And elevation has nothing to do with where the snow level is anymore in California. I mean, in the US, in California as well. But we have the warm side of the quote winter storm and the cold side of the quote winter storm. That's absurd meteorologically, but yet we have the whole so-called climate science community pretending that's normal, pretending that there's not weather modification operations going on. We can see it on radar. They can certainly see it as well. We have Chinese scientists. I would encourage your listeners to search this. Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm. We had major media covering it. Popular Science, MSNBC, Fox News, they all covered this. But yet, when we bring this up in the US, that this is happening here, there's instant marginalization from the so called climate science community. So, again, the denial at this point is beyond absurd. They're using this as a weapon. And in regard to what they're doing to themselves, because I think, Nadia, that's your question in a sense. Why would they do this to themselves? What else have they done to themselves? We have 2,400 nuclear bombs that have been detonated, that it's contaminated the entire planet and every living thing on it, including the controllers, but they did it anyway. We have Fukushima, triple nuclear meltdown, no technology to fix it, no end in sight, and yet we're building 60 more nuke plants right now. Chernobyl is not done. That sarcophagus is beginning to disintegrate, so Chernobyl is likely going to be a problem again soon. And we have, again, 440 nuclear power plants all over the globe that need 2 to 3 decades to cold shut down. If we have societal collapse in any of these regions, those plants are going to go into meltdown. We're going to have Fukushima times who knows how many. And further, if we look at climate engineering, let's tie this into the nuclear issue if we can. As I mentioned, climate engineering destroying the protective layers of the atmosphere, starting with the ozone layer. Now we're much more susceptible to a coronal mass ejection, a CME, solar flare.
Mm.
If that happens now on a significant scale and it shuts down grids in various parts of the world, now we may have nuclear plants that can't cool themselves without that grid power. Fukushima happens again. So it's from every conceivable direction, climate engineering is literally a near-term existential threat.
Surely they do understand that the havoc that they are creating elsewhere, but when it comes to climate, does not stay there. They must realize that they will eventually be brought into the chaos and demise brought about by their own operations.
Let's look at what psychoanalysis has determined from those in power. There's a common thread, and this is straight from the manual, if you will, that the types of mental deficiencies those in power have, because most of us wouldn't want that kind of power. We wouldn't want to wield that sort of control over everyone, but they crave it. And the common thread between the various psychological conditions of those who crave power and control, as you just so correctly described, is this: a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. Does an addict care that the next fix might kill them? They don't care. They won't stop. They can't stop. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. Does a cancer intend to kill its host? No. And that's what we're dealing with, a malignant cancer here that has taken control of society. The cancer intends to proliferate unchecked. The host eventually dies. And that's exactly the mentality we're dealing with. And they are not going to let go of this weather weapon. They're not going to let it go. And at this point, they see populations as not just expendable, but a liability. So the fact that these toxic elements being sprayed into our skies, at minimum, at absolute minimum, indisputably, are making us all dumber by the day, easier to control. We see IQs dropping eight it's 8 to 10 points in the last generation alone. In fact, it's 8 to 13 points, I think, by the latest study. That's an extraordinary drop in intelligence. We're inhaling these nanoparticles of toxic elements, again, with every breath we take. According to recent science study that we now have, we may be inhaling as many as 20 million nanoparticles in every single breath we take. Those particles are so small, they cross the blood-brain barrier. They go straight through our olfactory nerve into the bloodstream. And to describe how small these particles are, because that sounds like an extraordinary statement. How could we be inhaling 20 million particles in a single breath? You can fit 60 to 100,000 nanoparticles across the width of a human hair. That's how small these particles are. That's what they're spraying. That's why they're so bioavailable. That's why they're so destructive. They're being uptaken into everything. And if this, again, this serves the power structure as well, debilitating a population, making them easier to control because they're simply not firing on all neurons. So that's the lens through which the power structure looks at this, a way for them to hang on to their power, to subdue populations, to manipulate them, to control them, to dumb them down, sicken them, debilitate them. And that's certainly a part of this agenda as well. So it's complex. There are many, many layers, but none of them rational, none of them in any sense anything less than completely malevolent. We have documents, a U.S. military document titled Owning the Weather by 2025 that talks about, quote, full spectrum dominance, that exact term. And the term is clear. It means to control everything. And that's the mentality we're dealing with. And so, again, back to just to remind about the so-called climate science community, all of whom are denying this issue, the so-called environmentalists who pretend that renewable energy will save us. when it absolutely won't. And again, that's my background. I worked for Bechtel Power Corporation, largest engineering firm in the world. I had a background in one of the first solar plants in the US. I'm on solar, wind, and hydro myself. My home was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine. But so-called renewable energy isn't. It's not going to save us. It's simply a carbon fuel extender at best. And the the notion that this is going to, in any sense, save us is incorrect. And we have these so-called environmental communities also denying climate engineering because they want to protect their 501c3 nonprofit status. And we know this is true. We're not guessing. Our attorneys at geoengineeringwatch.org have spoken to attorneys from all the major so-called environmental groups. I don't want to call them environmental groups because they don't deserve to be called that. Their hypocrisy is absolutely mind-numbing. That they won't address this issue because they don't want to lose their nonprofit status. So they are ignoring the single most environmentally destructive human activity of all because they want to make sure they keep getting their donations tax-free. That's extraordinary hypocrisy for us, Nadia. There can be no legitimate discussion of the state of the climate from any side of the fence, from any perspective, without addressing this issue first and foremost. And that's our problem because both sides of the fence are doing exactly that. They're omitting, ignoring the climate engineering elephant in the room, and that simply renders that conversation illegitimate. We have a factor that's so massive that involves governments all over the world, either actively or passively participating. And we look at the COP27 conference that just happened and the other COP conferences on the climate. What did we see at those conferences? We saw massive climate engineering events that were demonstrations for the attendees at those conferences. During the last conference, COP27, we had a massive coast-to-coast, completely engineered surface cool down. And I stress surface. These are shallow layers of cold in the surface. Cold air is dense. It descends, it sits on the surface. So when you chemically nucleate the clouds with patented processes of chemical ice nucleation, you create this cold dense layer and it skews the temperatures on the surface radically to the downside. That was a demonstration for the COP conference. Previous COP conferences, we had Copenhagen. Same thing. We had a massive engineered cool down there. We had Cancun. Same thing as well. We had record cold temperatures at the Cancun Climate Conference at the time of the conference, in spite of far above normal temperatures in all surrounding areas. How can that possibly happen? That's a demonstration of climate engineering to those in attendance because that's what those conferences are about. They're not about changing business as usual. They're not about doing anything to actually protect the environment. They're about forcing countries to either actively or passively go along with climate engineering behind the curtain. That's exactly what those conferences are about. So again, from any side of the perspective, no legitimate discussion of climate without discussing this issue first and foremost. And both sides of this argument are doing exactly that.
Apart from the devastation of ecological and like natural systems, it's also affected, as you did refer to earlier, with Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases have, according to some reports, quadrupled in the last 5 years.
Correct.
What other health-related consequences has your research come up with?
Respiratory, everything. Every other commercial we see here in the US is asthma, this, allergy, that, COPD, every imaginable breathing disorder. These particles are extremely inflammatory in the respiratory system. So is it any wonder that we see this kind of disease skyrocketing in the US, respiratory disease? And we have all so-called air quality testing designed not to detect these particles. So-called public protection agencies test for PM10 at best, 10 microns. Some test for PM2.5, but even PM2.5 is unimaginably larger than nanoparticles, which go completely undetected by design. The specific elements we're looking for are not being, or that we're dealing with, are not being looked for either. And we know this firsthand. I've been in closed door meetings in the California state capital, Sacramento. Top EPA officials told to my face the entire system is rigged. They are told to test for combustion particulates only. The rest of their sample goes straight out the window. I was told to my face by an EPA official that we don't care if we get a sample that's radioactive. It's not combustion particulates, and we're not going to report on it. What sort of public protection is that? So the whole system has been designed not to detect these particles They go under the radar, even though there's tens of millions of tons of them coming down on us. It takes an extraordinary amount of material to cover the entire skyline. And back to the fires, Nadia, in the West and many other parts of the globe. Same with the fires. We have the entire so-called environmental community, the so-called climate sciences, also blaming the fires completely on, quote, climate change with no mention of climate engineering. So when we look in the case of the California fires, I would encourage your listeners to search geoengineeringwatch.org, look at the engineering wildfire section. For the entire length of our existence, a decade and a half, we have tried to sound the alarm that climate engineering was going to set the stage for unprecedented wildfires, and that's exactly what has happened. And how do we know this? Because when we can see on satellite imagery, climate engineering cutting off the precipitation from, for example, the US West, destroying the ozone layer, which is killing the trees from the top down. Roots are dying because of the elements in our rain. So, lack of water, the rain that does fall is toxic. We have an incendiary dust, and that's very important. These particles are incendiaries. So, when this dust settles down on the forest foliage, the forest floor, we have a much more flammable scenario with foliage that is very dried out anyway because of the conditions I already mentioned. And now we have also, because these elements are electrically conductive, we have more dry lightning. So, from every conceivable direction, climate engineering is the core causal factor for the much more intense fires that are burning right now. The planet would have responded in a very different way without climate engineering. We would have had more rain as the planet warms. The atmosphere carries 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. It must rain more on a warming planet, not less. If it's raining less overall, and it is, there has to be an element we're not being told about, and that element is climate engineering. So back to the wildfires, whatever the agendas, whatever the objectives, we can say definitively that what is setting the stage for these fires to burn with such ferocity is the conditions that are being established by climate engineering. And if I could add one more factor to that, we found a US military document. It's posted on our site that's titled Forest Fires as a Military Weapon and describes everything that I just described as being the means with which they would establish the conditions for forests to burn with this kind of ferocity on a military document. Think about that. So when we have the so-called climate science community blaming the epic wildfires on just, quote, climate change and not mentioning climate engineering, that conversation is completely illegitimate. In fact, it's criminal.
US military having a premeditated attack planned on its own soil.
Yes, we found even within that document, it's all posted at geoengineeringwatch.org. Again, forest fires as a military weapon. Your listeners can examine the entire document themselves. We found multiple sites, I believe about a dozen and a half, within the borders of the US, including Mount Shasta, where I live, as sites that were studied for this type of process. Why would they do that? Why would our own military study sites within our own borders as potential sites for this type of operation? Again, it's alarming to the core. We have a completely out of control military industrial complex that knows no borders, has their own agendas. And again, we can speculate on those agendas, but the fact that climate engineering is doing everything I've described in this exchange is inarguable.
California's drought comes to mind. Can you conclusively tell me that that was an example of climate engineering and not a natural phenomenon?
Yes. And I would encourage your listeners to look at our data at geoengineeringwatch.org, how far back it goes. Even a presentation I did in front of a large audience even a decade ago called Engineered Drought Catastrophe, Target California. Everything I said in that presentation 10 years ago has happened. Not because I was looking into a crystal ball, but because I was looking at data, satellite imagery, and if these operations continued, it had to happen. I had meetings at the Capitol with the state governor, Gavin Newsom, and his top aide, explaining exactly what happened, presenting data which they couldn't argue with. They didn't argue with. And yet, what has Gavin Newsom done? Exactly what he's told to do: pretend that this issue isn't occurring, to never mention it. So, again, we have a matrix that is in total control. Those who serve it are completely obedient, and Gavin Newsom is one who serves it without question. And we have a population that is choosing to believe whatever they're told, choosing to accept whatever denial they're given by official sources, while climate engineering operations are virtually wreaking havoc with the planet's life support systems. And if it doesn't change, if these operations aren't stopped completely and immediately, our outlook is grave, Nadia, and then that's based on solid statistics.
It would seem that in order to manipulate such large populations, that there's an intelligence element involved.
Well, certainly there is. I completely agree with you on that front, and we have too many people that are now so programmed that they ignore what they see with their own eyes. When you can look at the skies and see an aircraft leaving a trail from horizon to horizon, which is not condensation. I want to stress that these are not condensation trails. These are particulate dispersions,
Mm.
and we see them turning on and off. We have film footage of them turning on and off. We have up close photographs of the nozzles, retrofit nozzles mounted on the wing pylons, aimed into the exhaust jet stream to make it look like, quote, condensation.
There was also an expert in the dimming that said that what's coming out of airplanes is not a natural result of the way in which fuel burns.
Numerous experts in the dimming said that. For your listeners to know a little bit about the dimming, there's U.S. Air Force generals stating on the record that these operations are going on. There's former government scientists stating on the record, former Canadian Minister of Defense. And yes, it does not behave in that way, especially when we consider, as far as the quote condensation trail lie, we have all military tankers and all commercial carriers fitted with what's known as a high bypass turbofan jet engine. That is a jet powered fan. 90% of the air that moves through that engine is not combusted. That engine, by design, is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances. And again, we have up close film footage of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible, turning on and off. End of discussion. It's not condensation. Yet, back to your original question, we have a population that is willing to ignore their own eyesight, their own sense of reason, and accept the official denial. And that's scary. And that's back to the psychological part of what you're describing. That's how programmed the population is at this point. And the fluoride in the water, the aluminum in the air, all of these elements are cognitively very destructive. And at what point do we glue all this together, add some programming, and we have a population that's simply ignoring this very near term existential threat and accepting whatever they're officially told. And if that doesn't change, again, our outlook is grave, Nadia.
I think it goes to show how psychologically thought out the entire thing was, because they are relying on
Yes.
the human tendency to reject the idea that there can be something that nefarious.
Yes. Yeah, that is absolutely, absolutely core. What you just stated is core to the denial. We hear that they wouldn't do this to themselves argument, therefore it can't be happening. They ignore everything else, everything they see. And again, back to the nuclear detonations, they did it to
Mm.
themselves. Back to the Fukushima scenario, which is an existential threat by itself. Again, we have no
Mm.
technology to fix it, no end in sight, and we have 440 nuke plants in operation, power plants, and we have 60 more under construction. They are doing it to themselves. We have enough nuclear weapons to destroy humanity about 1,000 times over or more, and yet we're building more. We're not dealing with sanity, but we have a population that will find one simple premise that I just mentioned. They wouldn't do this to themselves. And then they ignore everything else. They ignore their sense of reason, their sense of logic, their sense of eyesight, and just go
Mm.
on about their lives. And that's a recipe for near term omnicide on our planet.
Mm. Bill Gates has come up and been referred to as the sugar daddy of geoengineering. To what extent and in what ways is he involved in either promoting it, bankrolling it? What do we know?
Bill Gates is simply a prop in the play. Climate engineering was fully deployed before Bill Gates was even born. We have patents going back well over 100 years. So, in the case of Bill Gates, in the case of, you may have seen the recent publicity about the geoengineering experiment launched in Baja California, that Mexico now has passed a moratorium on geoengineering because of that. All smoke and mirrors. We had, going back to the 2010 biodiversity conference, the International Biodiversity Conference, we had the ETC group pass a global moratorium on geoengineering, and people went back to sleep as if they could put this issue to rest now. Nothing but intended smoke and mirrors to pacify populations. The experiment in Mexico that there was so much publicity on recently was simply an individual that put a few balloons into the atmosphere that may have carried a few pounds of material to the stratosphere, may have.
Mm.
And then we have that issue eclipsing the fact that we have likely into the thousands of aircraft every single day around the globe dumping tens of millions of tons of material annually. Nothing said about that. All the focus on a single experiment, publicity stunt, few balloons in Mexico, smoke and mirrors, distracting populations, and all sides of the fence taking the bait, if you will. Again, it's to me unbelievably perplexing that this issue is being completely denied and ignored by all sides of the fence when it's at a point now where it's so extensive. We have what's called global dimming. That's the name of our film, The Dimming.
Mm-hmm.
A condition called global dimming, which is the amount of sunlight that now no longer reaches the surface of the planet. It's about 20 to 30%, depending on the study you look at. We have some scientists pretending, or they're covertly selling climate engineering by pretending what they call the aerosol masking effect, which is simply another name for climate engineering, which they won't acknowledge, is somehow saving us from ourselves. Couldn't be further from the truth. Just because you put some toxic particles into the sky and block some of the sun and create a temporary cool down on the surface doesn't mean you're doing anything but malevolent operations. These operations, again, contaminating every breath we take, toxifying soils and waters all over the globe, destroying the ozone layer, which then you have the downstream cascading consequences. The extreme UV radiation is killing plankton all over the globe now. We have plankton populations down in the Atlantic by 90%. The other oceans are probably in a similar condition. We're waiting for studies on those directly related to climate engineering, and no one will acknowledge that. So the so-called climate science community at this point, Nadia, I would describe as nothing less than criminal accomplices in the cover-up of climate engineering.
Those people that are curious about the content of what we've discussed, what would you suggest as, perhaps a positive to end off this interview that, they can do?
That's an extraordinary good point, and that what our objective as a geoengineeringwatch.org is not to have anybody believe what we say. It's asking them to look at the data themselves, look at the film footage themselves, look at the documents themselves, decide for themselves. And that's our goal, is to present this data, to make it available. And when one realizes this is going on in our skies, that this is an existential threat, what can we do? Because it can be a very debilitating revelation to understand the scale of what's going on above us. But we're not powerless. And if we, in fact, work together, if we share this issue credibly, a picture is worth 1,000 words. At geoengineeringwatch.org, for example, we do make printed materials available less than our cost. Our only goal is to get them into circulation. We have PDF files that people can print our materials themselves wherever they're at in the world. Our only goal, again, to use that as a tool to wake up others. If all of us help to bring this to light, and this effort will take all of us, if if you introduce this data to two people on the first day of a 30-day month, and them to two each the second day, and so forth for 30 days, that's into the millions. If we work together and we push this issue to the light of day, I would argue we'll cause a shockwave around the world. We have a chance of stopping these programs from the inside out, because those participating, and this is very, very important to understand, military personnel and others participating are being told they're doing something benevolent, something necessary, something that's helping the planet, which could not be further from the truth. If we can push this issue to light, we can overturn that paradigm. And we do have a chance of stopping these programs and allowing the planet to respond on its own to the damage already done. And that is the greatest leap we can take in the right direction. So we encourage people, search the activist suggestions link on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for much more instructions on how to help.